Today, we will be drawing a realistic apple and orange. We will be using crayons. Beginning with our lightest color, yellow, let's carefully look at the shape of the objects we're going to draw. So our apple and our orange are a round shape. So we're going to start with not quite a perfect circle because we want to look at the exact shape, and most things in nature are not a perfect circle. So we're going to draw that basic shape first for the apple and then for the orange, and pay really careful attention to the size and placement of our fruits. Now let's carefully add some details, such as the stem on the orange where the creases are, and then also we're going to add the stem on the apple. Alright, so I've peeled some of the paper off of the yellow crayon, and we're going to use it on the edge to fill in some of the areas on our apple and orange. We're still working with our light color, and then eventually we'll add some darker colors to get a more realistic representation of what the orange and the apple look like. So look at what your fruit has on it, because it's going to be different than what I'm looking at. Every single piece of fruit is unique and individual. Alright, so now we're moving to our next lightest color for the orange, which is a yellow-orange crayon. And for the most part, we're working on top of where we already colored in some yellow, but we're looking closely at the orange to see where is the light hitting the orange, where it looks a lighter shade of orange, and where is there not as much light hitting the orange. So for yours could be different depending on what your light source is. Observe closely the object that you are drawing, whether that is a piece of fruit or another object, and then draw what you see, not what you think you see. And don't be afraid to layer on top of other colors that you've already done. Alright, so we're going to go back on top of some of the yellow-orange with more yellow. This is going to blend the colors so that you have variety. You have some yellow and orange that when they mix together, it gives you a brighter area on the actual object. And you'll see that as you're drawing. You can experiment with this a few times, do some color swatches to the side, and just blend and layer your colors. And then go back on top again with a little bit more orange until you get it to look like what you see. Alright, so as you may have guessed, we're working from basically light to dark. So now we're going back into this orange with another orange. This is just regular orange. So we've done yellow orange, and now regular orange. And we're looking closely at the actual real life orange to see where those darker parts are. And as we keep going darker, we're going to get more detail, and it's going to start to look more and more like a real orange. Just like before, we're going to layer some of those lighter colors on top of the darker color that we just did. So we're layering a little bit of the yellow orange onto the regular orange, just to kind of build up the depth of color in our drawing. And this is going to make it look really finished and advanced as far as coloring skills go. And now we're going even darker. This is a red orange. So we're going to do the same thing we've been doing of looking closely at the real life orange that we're drawing from, and go in and add these darker areas, especially when you're looking at an orange, like the creases tend to be a lot darker. And then of course the places where there's not as much light hitting the orange will be darker. So go ahead and add your darker colors, build up those layers. Just like we've been doing, we are still layering. So we're going back into the regular orange and using that to blend the color, to blend in that red orange, and give it a really realistic look as we're coloring in the image on our paper. So this is a good technique to use to get those layers and blend and blend and blend, so you get a lot of depth and realism to your drawing. You can even go all the way back to that beginning color, that yellow, and use that in any areas where you might see reflected light. Reflected light happens when the light hits the table surface and bounces back onto the object. So sometimes you have a little bit of a lighter area bouncing back up to the underside of your object, like in the orange, and use that to add where you see light hitting. We're going to give some attention to the stem detail that we haven't really given any attention to, and we're starting that with the light green, a yellow green, a little bit of brown. It might be different on your orange, so look closely. What colors do you recognize? In mine, I saw a little bit of green and a little bit of brown, so those are the two crayon colors that I'm using, but yours might be different, of course. You can do your own thing. And then because it's sort of deeper into the orange, so it's recessed, it's got more of a shadow, and blue is a good color to use for shadow. While we are working on the shadow on the stem, this is a good time to use that blue crayon and work into some of the shadow areas on the rest of our orange. So especially in those creases that might be shadowed, we can go in very lightly with the blue, and then again, very lightly, don't go too hard, very lightly add a layer of blue on the side of the orange where the light isn't hitting as much, so where it's a little bit darker. And this feels funny at first because you're thinking, wait, oranges aren't blue. But in fact, shadows are usually the opposite color of the main color of the object. So if you have a color wheel and you were looking at it, the opposite of orange is blue, and that's why colors on an orange object can have a bit of a blue tone, and that's what we're using to get the shadow and get that more three-dimensional 3D look to our colored in orange here. Just like we did before, we are layering those colors to help them blend and look more realistic. So going a little bit backwards in order of when we were going light to dark, this is our darkest, our red orange going on top of the blue shadow. Going to get even a little bit more advanced now. We're going to add the shadow that is on the table surface. So when you're drawing in a shadow for an object, you usually want to draw the lines horizontally so that your object doesn't look like it's floating. You want to follow the parallel lines of your table surface and try to do that. And then the shadow's usually a little bit heavier or darker closer to the object, and then a little bit lighter further away from the object. Every shadow looks different. Your shadow is going to look different than my shadow. Your lighting is different. Mine kind of has two overlapping shadows because I have two light sources on this particular object. So it depends what your light looks like. And a lot of the times in a shadow, you might see the color of the object also reflected a little bit. So there's a little bit of orange in mine because it is on a white surface, and that orange is reflected onto it. So look closely at what yours looks like. Yours is going to be different as you're drawing your shadow. And now we're going to work on our apple, and the lightest color other than that yellow is going to be yellow-green. My apple has some green on it, so I am working on the green parts first with the lightest green I have. Alright, so just like we did in the orange, we are layering, and this time I'm layering yellow on top of that green. I'm also using that yellow on the lightest side of the apple where the light is hitting it the most, because that is going to have the lightest tone, lightest shade for color. So go ahead and add that where you see light hitting. This is the red orange. Now you would think there's no orange. It's an apple, it's not orange, but the lighter part of the apple isn't as deep of a red. So to get that lighter shade of red, we're going to start with the closest color we have, which is red orange. And that's what I'm using to layer in where I see some of the lighter red areas on my apple. I actually ended up putting that red orange on almost anything that was still white on the apple, and even overlapped some of that green and yellow that was already there. And now I'm going to move on to actual red, just regular red, and build up some layers using that red crayon overlapping on top of the red orange crayon that I already applied. Use that red as well to add some detail to the stem, and also the sort of shadow area where the stem is getting inserted into the apple. So where there's that little indent in the top of the apple, you want to add a little red to that as well to start building up the shadow area. And we're layering, so I'm back to that red orange. I'm using that to blend and layer the colors that I've already applied, that red, and really start to get some depth to the color of this apple to start making it look even more realistic. So go ahead, just like we did with the orange, blend and layer your colors depending on what you see on the actual apple that you are observing. And back to the red for some more layering. And now we're going back with that yellow-green, reworking some of those areas that have gotten red or red-orange layered over them just to give them the same level of richness as the rest of the apple. And working from light to dark within the green area, we are now using a regular green. And this regular green is going to be used for two things. One, to darken up some of the green area, but also we're going with that opposite color technique to bring in the shadow. So in our orange, our opposite for orange was blue, but on an apple, our opposite on the color wheel for a red apple is going to be green. So where we see some of the darker, deeper reds or some of the shadow areas, we're going to add a very light layer of green, the same way we did with the blue on the orange. Alright, so we're observing that there is a cast shadow coming from the orange blocking the light that's going onto the apple, and that is why we have that green that we're using on both the left and the right side of the apple, because there is that shadow being put onto the apple from the orange. And as we've been doing, we are layering. So we did that green, and now we're going back in with the red to give it a more blended and incorporated look on this apple to make it look a little more polished, a little more finished, a little more intentional. And now back to the yellow. We're going in with that yellow to pick up some of those highlights, those lighter areas that may have gotten inadvertently darkened. We want to add them in there. It also helps to blend some of the colors we've already placed. So going back in and adding yellow to where we see either the actual yellow color on the apple or just a lighter area. Alright, so we are picking up that brown to work mostly on the stem. The stem is definitely has more of a brown tone to it, so we're using that for the stem and the shadow at the base of the stem especially. For continuity in this particular drawing, we're going to go back to the blue for the shadow that's on the table. Sometimes shadows don't have a blue tone to it, but since we did have the blue that we used for the orange, and this is the same drawing, so to keep this composition fairly uniform, we're going to keep with that blue shadow. It's hard to get a really accurate representation of a shadow using crayons, but blue is usually a safe go-to for a shadow. And then we do still have a little reflected color. This time we're using the red-orange for that reflected color. Now we're going to grab one more color. We're going to grab, or lack of color, we're going to grab white. And we're going to use that on both the apple and the orange where we see the lightest area. Here is our realistically rendered observational drawing in crayon of an orange and an apple.